Hello.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing pretty good. So my name's Alex. Nice to meet you. From what Joe told me, it sounds like you were just wanting to focus only on cars for today. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So to start out with, then I think we can go over some kind of background information, like just strategy for how to approach it, and then after that, maybe go through one or two passages. Does that sound good?
Yeah, totally.
Okay. So my first question then is, how do you approach cars right now? So just kind of your overall strategy from when you first see a passage, like do you read the passage first, do you go to the questions first, and then how do you go about answering the questions?
Okay. It really depends on the passage. I usually would want to talking about the whole section. I try to knock out the 5 question passages usually beforehand.
Okay, so
Um,
you skip ahead to those.
yeah, I usually
Okay,
jump around within the section.
all right.
Um, and then usually I would go paragraph by paragraph and I would highlight what the focus is, especially if it supports the main idea or whatever the author's approach is. Um
Okay. So so when you say you're highlighting, is that like one sentence per paragraph or just
yeah.
any important sentences?
Usually one sentence, and if it's a
Okay.
switch in argument, I would highlight the like but or otherwise, the transition words.
Okay.
So I try to keep it as minimal as possible. And I usually do have a good idea by the end of the passage, depending on difficulty, of course, on if I understand it or not.
Right.
And then I would switch over to the questions. I wouldn't read through the answer choices unless it specifically wants to focus on the answer choices. So I usually would have an idea on what the author would want before reading the answers. Um, in addition to kind of not necessarily like a puzzle, but just making sure that I know where I'm looking for, if that makes sense.
Right.
Um,
Like going back to the passage for
yeah,
evidence? Okay.
yeah. Sometimes I end up missing, like if I don't read back enough or if I don't read forward enough, then the answer is usually there. Otherwise, I would think that the answer is like right there where it's showing. But then again, I have to read around. So that sometimes the context is an issue.
Okay.
Also, sometimes I lack reading comprehension, period. Like I suck at it. So going through the question choices anyway is kind of difficult in order to understand, um, literally to understand each answer choice, even though it may represent the exact same information that was in that paragraph. Um, Otherwise, that's usually been my go-to. I was kind of exploring different ways since I was during with my last tutor, especially just I've been sitting at like the 120s consistently the past couple months. And so I was even thinking of, well, why don't I go through 3 questions, see if I can pinpoint like the subject of the question and see if I can find that in the passage. So then that also kind of helps to gather more of that context clue effect that I had trouble with in the other strategy.
Okay.
But then I may be then missing like the main idea because I'm looking for specifics or just the overall idea. Because
Okay.
again,
So you're talking
yeah,
about so that strategy was like you would go to the questions first?
yeah.
Okay. Um, yeah, I mean, I think generally it's better to read the passage first, so I would probably try to avoid doing that.
Mhm.
So and then my last question, do you normally write anything down when you read the passage or just highlight?
I did. I tried to do both, either highlight versus writing down, but it just takes me so much time to write down. And then I also have a tendency of wanting to overwrite, even
Yeah.
though I would do like short phrases or symbols being like X means Y and then Z is opposing X. but it still would, it kind of distracts me, honestly, because then I
Yeah.
lose focus of what I read because I'm so focused on what I'm reading and what I captured, and then I can't apply it to the remainder of the passage.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And then how long do you normally spend reading the passage?
Um, 4 to 5 minutes. So I try to make sure that I do 10 minutes per passage.
Okay.
And that's been relatively fine. I don't end up getting through all nine. I usually get through either seven or eight
Okay, so timing is an issue for you in the card section?
ish. Yeah. But I think
Okay.
once I also have a solid strategy, I think timing would just end up picking up on its own because it's
Yeah,
just
yeah. I do
very,
think that's part of it. I mean, I think though, even once you get the strategy down, I mean, timing is very hard in the cars section. Like even, I mean, even people who are scoring really high in the cars section, timing is still something to consider, and it's something you kind of have to keep track of. Um, so one suggestion that I have actually is instead of skipping around and doing the 5 question ones first, I would say just do it kind of straight through, beginning to end. And I think that will help you a little bit in terms of timing. I think it makes it easier to keep track of time and to keep track of how many questions you have left. Just because you can kind of quickly glance up at the timer and
mhm,
then you see, okay, I'm on question number 26 and more than half the time is used up. Okay, that means you need to go faster. So
yeah,
I think it just makes it easier to do it that way. And I think it also, um, you're using up a little bit of time kind of flipping through the questions. Like it's not going to be that much time, but it
I
would
know.
be probably an extra at least 1 or 2 minutes total just spent like going through like skipping ahead to different questions and stuff. So I do think that will help your timing is just doing it straight through.
Hmm.
Um, so I would say just try it that way, see how that goes for you. Um, so I'm going to share my screen here and then just go through my overall approach.
Hmm.
So the first thing, the most important thing in the car section is that everything is in the passage. The important part is just finding it.
Hmm.
Um, and kind of what I mean by this is like if you've taken any kind of language arts or literature class, a lot of the time in those classes, they want you to kind of read between the lines and extrapolate from the passage. Like there's a lot of independent thinking that they expect you to do beyond just what's in the passage. Now, the cars section is kind of the exact opposite of that. It's like they want you to take everything that's in the passage very literally, and all the answer choices you can just interpret um, very literally. It's like you don't have to you want to avoid making any kind of assumptions or extrapolating too much from what's in the text. The important thing in the cars section is to just focus on what is actually in the passage.
Hmm.
Um, Now, the way that I would actually approach a passage, so number one, I would read it pretty quickly. Sometimes I would read a passage in 2 minutes or maybe even slightly less than 2 minutes, depending on the passage. Um, I don't think you necessarily have to do it that fast. It's a personal preference kind of thing, and it depends on your reading speed. You just have to experiment and figure out what is the fastest that you can possibly read and still understand it somewhat well. Um, I treat the first reading of the passage as kind of a skim, like it's not going to be a really detailed read. It's not about picking up on all the small details. It's more of a big picture kind of. And so the two things to focus on as you're doing that would be to understand the main idea of the passage. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. That's just what you want to focus on when you're reading. Um, Number one, because it's pretty common in the car section to have a question just asking about the main idea. And so if you're consciously focusing on that as you read, kind of like asking yourself, what is the main idea? It'll make it much easier to answer those kinds of questions. And then also, even the more detail oriented questions, if you get the main point of the passage, it does help you narrow those down a little bit in terms of eliminating certain answer choices.
Mhm.
Um, Now, number two, make a mental map of the passage. This is the hard part, and this is what's going to take a lot of practice. Um, so, the way that I like to do this is to break the passage down into three sections for most passages. Now, three is not always going to work perfectly. Like you may have to do two or four sections depending on the passage, just depending on how it's structured. But if you can, I would always try to stick with three, just because I think that's a number where um, it's few enough sections that you can actually keep it in mind and remember all of them. But it's also like if you try to do only two sections, well, generally the passage is going to be too complicated to just break it down into two sections like that. So I think
Mhm.
three is kind of the sweet spot where you want to stick with that number. So as I'm reading the passage, I will consciously think about um, the section breaks. And so as I'm reading the beginning, kind of the introduction, it's usually going to be pretty short. I would say the first section is generally one paragraph, maybe two paragraphs, depending on the passage. Um,
Mhm.
so obviously, the introduction is just where the author is introducing the topic,
Mhm.
and if it's a more of an opinion-based passage, where the author introduces their opinion on the topic. And so
Mhm.
that is kind of what you want to focus on for the first section is what is the overall topic of the passage and what is the author's point of view?
Mhm.
And as you're reading it, um, now eventually you want to do it mentally if possible. But one thing that I think is a pretty good practice exercise for this is to actually write it down. So as you're reading the beginning of the passage, so on your scratch paper, you could just write a one for section one, and then beside that, a very, very short summary. I think you should keep the summary very brief, probably less than 5 words if possible. Sometimes it may be closer to 10 words, but the idea is that as you're reading this first section, you want to break it down into as short of a summary as possible and then just jot that down on the paper. And then you get to section two, kind of the middle section of the passage. So as you're reading it, it's normally going to be a little bit more detail oriented than the introduction. And so you may have to, it may take a little bit longer to um, get all of the minor points from that. But the important thing when you're first reading the passage is don't worry too much about all the little details. It is more about the big picture. So even for the middle section of the passage, I would try to focus on the big picture as much as you can, and then just jot down a summary for that on your scratch paper. Now, the end section of the passage, it kind of depends on the passage how that section works. Um, some Cars passages do actually have an ending paragraph where it's like a conclusion and a summary of everything else. But I would say probably most passages don't really have that, and it just ends on a body paragraph. And
Mhm.
the way that I would try to break this down is even if it's just introduction and then just a bunch of body paragraphs, try to separate the body paragraphs into two different sections if you can. Um, and so you want to write down a little summary for the middle section and then another little summary for the end section. Um, and the purpose of doing this, the purpose of making a mental map of the passage, or if you're actually writing it out, doing it physically, um, is when you're answering the questions, it will help you in terms of knowing where to look for evidence. And I think that is really um, one of the most important things in the car section is just knowing where to look for evidence more quickly. Um,
Right.
because, in theory, if you have unlimited time, you should get all the questions right just because the evidence is there in the passage. But in
Mhm.
reality, you don't have unlimited time. So, really, the challenge and the thing to work on, and the thing that will affect your score the most, is being able to find the right evidence. Um,
Mhm.
and so, I think really the only way to do that is to read the passage quickly and to have an understanding of which sections of the passage are talking about what topic.
Mhm.
Does all of that make sense? I have a few other points here, but for this number one, any questions on that?
No, I'm also making notes on the side, so you're totally
Okay.
good for now.
Okay. And let me know if I need to slow down at all.
Mhm.
Um, okay. So number two, I would say always look back at the passage when you're answering questions, unless it's just um you're like 100% sure of the answer without looking back. But usually that's not going to be the case. So I would say for almost every question, um, you should refer back to the passage. And it sounds like you've already been doing that mostly. Is that right?
Yeah, and most of the time, yeah, again, it would
Okay.
typically make me that 50-50 again because of the reading between lines and context.
Okay. Well, so it's good that you're already looking back for the most part because I think actually a lot of people that I've tutored will just try to answer cars questions just based on memory from reading the passage instead of actually looking back, which is generally not a good strategy. That's not something you want to do. Um, but if you're reading the passage in about 4 to 5 minutes, I would think that you probably don't have time to fully look back for every single question, just because that would put you over the time limit. And so I think to really do this and actually go back and find evidence, it will help if you can read the passage faster. Do you think that would be realistic for you reading it in more like 2 to 3 minutes?
Um, I think it really depends on the type of passage, because if you would
Okay.
ask versus like music and history, I probably need to do history longer, or business and more of the social sciences would need to be leaning more towards the 3-4 minute end.
Okay.
Um, but again, that doesn't mean that all of the music passages are easy. It could just be a bunch of jargon and it's just taking a while
Yeah.
to go through it. So,
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I do think it varies depending on the passage because some passages are longer than others, some passages are harder than others. So it doesn't have to be exactly the same, but my recommendation is whatever the range of time that you're spending on passages, try to lower that down. So what I mean by that is the hard passages, if you're taking 5 minutes for those right now, try to take more like 4 to 4.5 minutes. And then the easy passages, if you're taking 4 minutes for those right now, you could try to go maybe even down to 2.5 minutes for the easy passages. And that will save you some time.
okay.
So the last thing right here, and this is pretty important actually, number three, when you're going back to find evidence, be as specific as possible and make sure the evidence you choose directly supports your answer choice and it's not just a kind of loose connection. And that's what I'm talking about when I say don't make assumptions and don't extrapolate from the passage. The evidence has to support your answer choice directly and not just be kind of somewhat associated with it. Um, and I think it's also good when you're finding evidence to narrow it down to a specific sentence. So instead of saying, paragraph two as a whole supports this answer choice, try to find a particular sentence in that paragraph that supports the answer choice that you go with. And I think being more specific like that helps you catch your own mistakes. Because if you keep it vague and think about it as like a whole section of the passage supports this answer, it's a lot easier to miss some of those details. But if you dive into the details and focus on them, you'll be way more likely to catch your mistakes.
Mhm.
Okay, so these are all my main points in terms of how to approach cars. Any questions on any of that before we get to a passage?
Nope, we're all good.
Okay, great. So I have some cars passages that I've written. We could do one of those, or we could do an AAMC passage. It's up to you.
Um, we can do one that you wrote, sure.
Okay. And when are you taking the MCAT?
So, funny enough, I ended up taking it this past Friday because I missed the 10-day deadline, but I am most likely going to repeat it end of May.
Okay. Did you void that one?
I didn't.
Okay. Um, okay, and you're planning end of May. All right. So how many of the AAMC materials do you have left?
I have, because I was plateauing on my cars, I didn't really touch upon volume two of the Q pack for cars. And then
Okay.
I went through all of the selection banks, but I didn't really get to the individual and more of the, I don't want to say weaker material, but
Okay. Well, that's good that you have a lot left then.
yeah.
Um, so I think in terms of cars, yeah, probably we should do one of my passages, and then if we have extra time after that and you want to do another one, we can do an AAMC passage
Mhm.
afterwards.
Sure.
So, all right. What kind of passage do you want to do in terms of like the topic?
Um, anything within social science, honestly. So like business,
Okay.
economics, history.
Okay. Um, all right. Yeah, okay. We'll do a history one. Um, all right, I'm gonna zoom in a little bit and then let me know if this is too small for you to read it.
No, that should be fine.
Okay. So I'm going to get a timer right here and time you reading the passage. So for this one, I would say try to read it in I don't know, maybe 3.5 minutes if you can. Um, and try out that method of writing out the summaries. Do you have any scratch paper with you?
Hmm.
Okay. So just as you're reading it, try to write a very brief summary for beginning, middle, and end. And then after the passage, I'm going to ask you to, I'm going to ask you what was the main idea, like what is the author arguing for, and what did you write down for your summaries, and then try to answer those without looking back at the passage. So basically, you want to understand the main idea, like try to memorize that, and then have good summaries for each section.
Okay.
All right, are you ready to start?
Mhm.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, I have some notes. I don't know
Okay.
how accurate they are, but
All right. So that was about 4 minutes, so not too bad in terms of timing. Did that feel like you were reading it faster than you normally would, or do you think that was pretty standard for this kind of passage?
a little faster, but I
Okay.
was more about not the details, so that's probably why it seemed faster because it was more of do you get the gist versus can you back up X, Y, and Z?
Okay. Sounds good. Um, so what do you think in terms of just the main point of the passage? Like, is the author arguing for something specific, or it's like, why did the author write the passage?
I don't think it's argumentative based. I think it's more based just informal, more based on the information.
Okay.
Um, more on like the change in the socialism and how it's affecting different countries. And then there was a focus on France and then the other Latin nations. But then the underlying factor is even though that they wanted to make the best of their socialism, the actual value or artistic energy, as it was said, was the same. Like that didn't change.
Okay. Yeah. So I think in terms of the main point, um, to summarize it very briefly, I think the first sentence, or I guess like the first phrase of the first sentence, just kind of summarizes the whole thing. So, the state of European nations in the year 1890. So, that's just kind of the whole focus of the passage, just talking about different European nations and their kind of social and political state in the year 1890. Um, and I think it's good to try to, if you're talking about the main idea of the passage, you want to think about it as concise as possible. And so if you can narrow it down to something really short like that, I think it helps in terms of really understanding the author's point. Um, Especially if you happen to get a question asking what is the author's main point in the passage. If you can summarize it really concisely like that, it'll help you a lot in terms of answering those questions. Um, okay, and then your summaries for each section, how did you break it down and what did you write?
Broke it down by paragraph.
Okay.
Um,
So you
so
did 4 for this one?
I did.
Okay.
Except the fourth paragraph was more of roughly, I didn't know where to fit. That's why I was like, it's kind of an outlier. But I
Okay.
guess sections 2 and 3 can be made into a larger section since it's more focusing on the specifics of the nations and what they did.
Okay.
Um, so the first one was that introduction of the political and government. And then was the middle class more of like an example of what they wanted?
Um,
Talk.
what do you mean by that?
Um, so was saying the idea of socialistic reforms was agitated, darkly threatening among the masses, but on the
Hmm.
other hand, the middle class is almost everywhere, and so on. And then
Right. Okay.
this first line of the second paragraph saying France wanted to basically try to achieve this as they wanted to for a long time, but they had
Hmm.
trouble. So I was saying that France was the first part of my second section summary was, well, France was having trouble rising to their expectations of the middle
Okay.
class.
Yeah. Um, well, yeah, I would say the middle class part is not necessarily relevant to France. I think that's kind of two separate points.
Okay.
And what was your summary again for the first section? Like, what did you write down?
Um, I said socialistic reforms and then an arrow to the middle class.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a pretty good section of the or a pretty good summary of the first section. It's just kind of I would say first it just introduces the idea that we're talking about the state of European nations in 1890. So maybe it would be a good idea to highlight that sentence actually. I know you can't do that on this, but like on the real MCAT where you can highlight, I would probably highlight state of European nations in the year 1890.
Okay.
Because I think that's a good just a good sentence that's the main point of the entire passage. And then, yes, I think the first paragraph would be socialistic reforms and middle classes. And then you said the second paragraph, um, you're saying France was not meeting their expectations, basically.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, and then I would also try to make a note for um, Italy as well for that paragraph, just because kind of the whole point of doing this, where you're writing down a summary of each paragraph, is so that you know where to look for evidence.
Mhm.
And so if you see a question asking about Italy, or if there's an answer choice that mentions Italy, you would want to know to look at paragraph two.
I see.
Um, okay, and then what did you say for paragraph three?
Three, I said that there were more nations that had the same trouble, but relatively, it just said that they were had trouble as well.
Okay, and then what about paragraph four?
Um, this is what I had no idea, but I said the art within did not change.
You said the art did not change.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, so paragraph four, I would say basically what it's saying is that um England and France, or England and Germany, were doing good politically, but not very good artistically, and that Germany used to have good art. That's kind of the author's point for paragraph four.
Okay.
Um, so here, I'll kind of go over how I would break this down. So I think I would probably do three sections for this one. Um, Instead of doing it by paragraph, I would say, so paragraph one, I do think that's kind of a whole section on its own. I think your summary of that one was very good. So, socialistic reforms, middle classes, that's kind of the main point of that one. Um, so section two, I would say, is paragraph two and the very beginning of paragraph three, where it
Mhm.
talks about the Latin nations in France. So I think that section for my summary, I would just write down uh, France, Italy, Latin nations, just so that I know if the question's asking about any of those countries, that would be where to look. And then I would say the last section is most of paragraph three and all of paragraph four. And what I would
Mhm.
write down for that is um, England and Germany, um, and then you could say like powerful in politics and military, but um, lacking in art or something like that.
Mhm.
And you see how the way that I did that, I'm just trying to get the gist of every section, um, summarize it in a kind of short way, and the main purpose of doing this is to just know where to look when you're going back for evidence.
Mhm.
Okay. Does all that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So let's go to the questions then. Um, Number one, according to passage information, which the following was not true of the European middle classes in the late 1800s. Okay, so where would you look for evidence for this one?
The first paragraph.
Okay, yeah. So go ahead and so actually, I would say read the answer choices first. I think it's good to look at those before you go back for evidence, because what I've noticed is a lot of people will read the question, go look for evidence, and then their interpretation of the passage doesn't line up with any of the answer choices. And if that happens, then you kind of have to start back from square one. So you read the answer choices and then go back to the passage again. I think it's better to just read them to begin with so that you can look back with the answer choices in mind.
Mhm.
Okay, so just go ahead and read over them, go back for evidence, and then tell me what you think.
I was able to eliminate, but then it was more of a 50-50.
Okay. So which ones did you eliminate?
Um, C and D.
C and D. Okay, so C, I think that one makes sense just because um it's talking about they had withdrawn voluntarily from active political fields. But okay, so what about D? Why did you cross that one
I thought that they would want, but oh, I don't know if I can highlight. Hold on. Maybe annotate. So right here, when it says, but on the other hand, the middle, oh, now this is in the way. Classes almost everywhere was anxious for long respite in which to enjoy the new social conditions created by themselves and for themselves.
out? Okay.
So I thought it was more that they wanted those new changes.
Um, okay, so what that sentence is saying actually is that they've already created the new social conditions. Do you know what the word respite means?
No.
Okay. So and that is something just in general in the car section, I think vocabulary is pretty important because a lot of the passages will have words that are not all that common.
Mhm.
Do you do any kind of vocab practice at all?
No.
Okay. Well, that may be actually helpful is to just do a little bit of vocab practice every day. So you can download any app on your phone, like there are lots of word of the day apps where it'll just give you a new vocab word every day. There's a website called vocabulary.com that I think is helpful for practicing vocab. And so if you find that that is an issue, like if you don't know certain words in the passages, I would recommend doing some kind of vocab practice. So in this passage, so it says a long respite. That means kind of like a break or a period of peace. So what this sentence is saying is that the middle classes were anxious for a period of peace to enjoy the new social conditions that they had created. Does that make sense?
So they were longing for that change for peace.
Um, it's almost saying that like they were longing for no change, like they wanted a period of peace without change because they had already created the new social conditions.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And then it says they represented the largest amount of intellectual force. They had withdrawn voluntarily from active political fields. So that's another piece of evidence there saying they had withdrawn voluntarily from active political fields. Well, that kind of means that they're not clamoring for social change if they're no longer involved in active political fields. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So I would say those two pieces of evidence there would make me think that um, D is the right answer.
Okay.
Um, and then, so A and B, do you see, like, can you find any evidence where we can eliminate A and B?
What was it? So I was actually between A and D but then I thought D was proven, but
Okay.
originally I was between A and D. But for B, what was it? I don't know if this is stretching it, but I mean, in addition to what was previously discussed, along with social conditions recreated by themselves and for themselves, I also thought part of the last sentence of the paragraph, losing all social affinities, became likewise isolated.
Okay. Which one were you saying that is related to?
I thought it was more for A,
A. Okay.
but I didn't like
Um,
succeeded.
so I think for A, where it says they had succeeded in creating a new societal role for themselves, the most relevant part would just be this sentence that we've already kind of talked about. They were anxious for a long respite in which to enjoy the new social conditions created by themselves and for themselves. So, the main point of what that sentence is saying is that they have already created these new social conditions themselves, and now they want a period of calm to enjoy those social conditions. So that's the most important evidence for A, saying that it is consistent with what the passage is saying, therefore it's not the right answer.
Mhm.
Um, and then B, it's kind of the same thing that we've just talked about, eager for a period of peace and tranquility. That's kind of just the word respite, like knowing what that word means. Um, so yeah, I would say that one is mainly just a vocab kind of thing. Um, and then C, we've already talked about that one, and so the right answer for this one is D. Does that
Okay.
make sense now that we've gone over it?
Hmm.
Okay, good. Um, so I think that you were able to find the relevant evidence pretty quickly, so that's good. It seems to me like the thing to work on the most would be interpreting the evidence. Is that kind of like when you've been practicing cards on your own? Is it usually like that? Like you'll find the right piece of evidence, it's just interpreting it that's the problem?
Yeah, interpreting and making those connections. Yeah.
Okay. Um, so this is where what we talked about in terms of like don't make assumptions and take everything the passage says literally. That's when you want to focus on those strategies, meaning that um, you find the evidence, so you know where to look in the passage. Now, as you're reading it, you want to try to understand what the author is saying and don't read between the lines. So only base your answer on what is actually in the passage. Um, do you think that when you're making mistakes there, do you think it's because you're making assumptions, or is it more that you're not understanding what the author is trying to say?
I think it's understanding.
Okay. Yeah, because I think those are kind of two separate issues. Okay. So that is honestly kind of hard to improve on. Like really the only way to work on that would be to read more, I think, and to do more cars practice. So that is the biggest issue for you. I would recommend like not only do the AAMC cars passages, but also try to do Jack Weston every day. Have you been doing those?
I did, and then my former tutor told me to stop
Okay. All right. Why did that tutor tell you to stop?
because I didn't think it was like it was because more of what I was asking for Jack Weston, I didn't think it was applicable anymore to AMC because it was
Okay.
not as specific and it wasn't really like drawing to the evidence or specific parts of the passage. It was more broad in general to the main idea and which one would more support or be evident towards the main idea.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think Jack Weston's definitely not perfect. Like their passages, I would say, are pretty good, but of course, I mean, they're just written by random people who are trying to write them the same as the AAMC. So of course, it's not going to be perfect. What about UWorld? Do you have any of those left?
I do. That was the one section she also told me not to do,
Okay.
not to do any
Um,
of the cars there.
well, okay. So why did she say not to do UWorld?
Because she didn't know how accurate it was to AAMC, but I did them anyway because I thought it
Okay.
was good representing of basically what we're doing now.
Well, all right. So here's the thing. There's not going to be any third-party resource that's perfectly accurate to AAMC. And
Yeah.
so there's really no way to find anything that's going to be perfect. You kind of just have to make do with what you have.
Mhm.
So if what you're struggling with the most is um, understanding the passage and interpreting what the author is saying, there's really no strategy that's going to help that much with that. It's more about just practicing it more and getting used to it. I would say if you're having trouble uh, finding the right evidence, that's when you can improve a lot by changing your approach and changing your strategy. But when it comes to just interpreting what the author's saying, it's harder to improve on and it just takes more practice.
Okay.
And I
Valid.
think though going through passages together in tutoring also helps with that because you have someone giving feedback in terms of interpreting the passage. And I think that should make a difference.
Agreed. Yeah.
Um, okay,
I would
so
start like doing with Chat GPT. I would like try and copy and paste if the system will let me and be like, how are you interpreting this? So it's like I'm already having a self-tutor there because
yeah,
I think that was the most beneficial for me to actually know where I'm heading while reading the passage versus just doing it alone, reading what I did wrong, and then hopefully I caught on to apply it next time.
okay, yeah. I mean, I think yeah, ChatGPT could probably help with that. I think having an actual person would definitely be better,
Obviously, yeah.
but yeah, when you're practicing on your own, that's not a bad idea. Okay, so let's go to number two. For which of the following statements does the passage provide additional support? Okay, so this is going to be one of those where you don't immediately know where to look. Like you have to look at lots of different sections in the passage. So just go ahead and look at each of these answer choices separately and then tell me what you think.
Mhm. So 50-50 again.
Okay,
Um, I was able to eliminate B because that was just more that was stated in paragraph one, and then it
right.
switched to idea, so it didn't really explain how or why it became agitated.
Okay, great.
Um, and then the other one that I eliminated was also C, a form which she
Okay.
yearned so long and so compulsively. But because it didn't really explain, I don't know, it's just being like, yeah, this is what they wanted, but then it switched over. So,
Yeah. And that's for these kinds of questions, it's important to when it's asking for which of the following statements does the passage provide additional support, that support has to actually support the statement, not just elaborate on it. And so I think you did a good job of eliminating those. And so for the France one, it does kind of elaborate on it, like it talks more about the state of France, but it's not actually supporting the idea that France had the form of government that it wanted. Um, and so that's good, and that's definitely how you want to be thinking about these types of questions.
okay. So the more specific was it didn't explain the form of government, even though it connected to say it wants to change, but
Yeah, it's like it elaborated on that quote, but it didn't actually support it.
okay, I understand.
Okay.
So it's best to do both for elaborating and support,
Um,
not
it's kind
one
of
or
like just so you want to focus on just the one that actually has support. So basically,
Okay.
what I'm saying is that a lot of people will choose an answer because the passage elaborates on that topic.
Mhm.
But in reality, what you should be looking for is for the passage to give additional evidence to support the quote that's in the answer choice and not just for it to talk more about that topic.
I
Like it has
see.
to actually give some kind of evidence to support it.
Hmm. Hmm.
So
But
you're
then,
between A and D.
right.
Okay. So go back and look at both of those and try to think about it in terms of which one of those actually has supporting evidence versus just elaboration.
Mm, okay. Okay. Yeah. Valid. So I think so I think for A, when it's talking about tasted all the fruits of the parliamentary system, so that was mentioned in paragraph three, third
Hmm.
sentence. It started listing off everything that England has done and then what Germany has done, but it didn't go into much about the parliamentary except of the political doctrines and the positive ideas, etc.
Right.
So I thought that's more of an elaboration. And then for
Okay.
D, that is in the last paragraph, first sentence, and then it's actually, I mean, that was also part of the breakdown was that England and Germany um didn't really change with their political, but Germany did with their arts. And that's going into more of the draining off of their creative forces, supporting that, or weak, I'm not assuming, but stating the facts that Germany kept the arts and we don't know about England. So
Okay. Yeah. So
that,
you're going with D.
yeah,
Okay. Great. Yeah, that's exactly right.
cool.
So where it talks about England, you're right. Where it's just so it talks about the parliamentary system, and then it just talks about other things. Like it's not really supporting the idea of the parliamentary system. And then um, for the last paragraph, it uses the examples of England and Germany to support the idea that there's the draining off of creative forces in art. So yes, this one is D.
Okay.
Um, and that's so this is something you want to kind of make a mental note of. This is a pretty common type of question you could see in the car section, talking about which one has support. You always want to think of it that way in terms of looking at support, not elaboration.
Mhm.
Okay. So,
Okay.
number three, which statement is least relevant to the main idea of the passage? So, for this one, um, this is a main idea question. So, you want to think about what is the main idea, and then which of these statements is least relevant to it.
How off was I up front with the main idea, or was I too specific?
Um, Tell me one more time what you said for the main idea.
Um,
It was the middle classes, right?
yeah, so it was, well, yeah, but it was more of like the socialistic reforms switching over to middle class in France and other nations having trouble um fulfilling not the requirement, but just wanting to mock that middle class aspect of what changed.
Um, yeah, I would say it's more like the main idea is just um so this is one of those passages where the author's not exactly making an argument one way or another. It's just more informative. And so
Mhm.
the main idea is just the state of European nations in this particular time period.
Okay, so straight up, got it. Okay.
Yeah, and I think when it comes to the main idea, the shorter your summary of the main idea, the more accurate it probably is.
Okay, that's
So if you
fair.
can break it down into something just very short like that, I think it's better than if you have a longer explanation of the main idea, you might be getting into more of the details or kind of minor points.
Mm-hmm. I understand. Okay. But aren't these with the least relevant? We would have to go back to the passage anyway, just to mark off if it was explained or different.
Um, kind of. Have you ever gone through the different types of cars questions?
A long time ago, but yes.
Okay. Do you remember what they are?
Um, I know that, well, we have the additional support, weak versus strong. So like if we take out information or if there was another idea, if it would disprove or strengthen. And then straight up asking about the main idea. And then one is also asking like if this were to be added, how would this change the argument?
Okay.
Um,
So the AAMC actually breaks it down very differently. So I'm just going to share my screen and go through that. I think it will be useful to actually know the different question types and to kind of think
oh, you're
about
talking
them.
about that. I'm sorry. I
Yeah.
understand now. Never mind.
Okay, so you
Yeah,
have
I
looked
was
at these?
aware with that. Yeah.
Okay. Do you know what each one is?
Yeah. So foundations of comprehension, basically pick a quote that straight up matches the answer. So
Yeah,
it's basically, did you understand what you read? Reasoning within the text, which is funny enough, what I have the most trouble with, is in the interpretation aspect is, do you know what they're applying? And then
right.
read
And
beyond.
number two that we just did, asking which of the following statements has additional support, that one is actually reasoning within the text.
Interesting. Okay. Thought that was comprehension. Yeah.
Um, no, I would say that's reasoning within the text because really reasoning within the text, you have to use a little bit of reasoning, and the kind of like the key thing about these is typically you have to look at multiple parts of the passage. So
Mhm.
foundations of comprehension, it's a little more straightforward. It's more like just what is the passage actually saying? But
Mhm.
reasoning within the text, it's more about making connections between multiple parts of the passage. So for that question, it's asking which statement has more support. So you're having to look at the connections between these parts. So you have the statement, and then you're looking for supporting evidence for the statement. Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay. And then reasoning beyond the text. What do you know about those?
It's evil. But um, I mean, basically you're given new information and you want to see if it's either going to strengthen or weaken the tone or main idea of the passage. So it's more of like a step further of how this could be applied to the topic or
Yeah,
so on.
exactly. Right. So the important part for reasoning beyond the text is new information. Now, there are two kind of different ways that they could ask you to use the new information. It's either how does the passage affect the new information? So that's what I would call type one for reasoning beyond the text. And type two is how does the new information affect the passage? So, and I think it's good to if you see a reasoning beyond the text question, make the distinction there.
Mm-hmm.
Ask yourself, are they asking me to take what's in the passage and apply it to a new situation, or take the new situation and apply it to the passage? Because
Mm-hmm.
that kind of determines how you would go about answering it.
That's why I
So,
usually do those questions last, because
okay,
then, because I would know more about the passage and if I actually understood it based on the comprehension and reasoning within the text questions. So I usually try to save the beyond the text for last. I don't know if that's a good way to approach it, but it's just more of me being more confident that I understand and I'm on track of the intentions.
yeah, I mean, I don't think that's a bad idea necessarily. Personally, I never did it that way. Like, I just started on question one and then just did every question sequentially. Like, I never really skipped around.
Mhm.
But if you feel like that's helping you, I think that is not a bad strategy.
Okay, sounds good.
Um, I think what might make more sense though, if you're going to do something like that, is to do any main idea type questions first and then detail-oriented questions last.
Yep, yep, yeah.
Because if you could have a reasoning beyond the text question that says, which of the following would most weaken the main idea of the passage? And that's actually a question that you'd want to do first, probably.
Yeah.
Um, but again, I think skipping around could just be using up time, though. And that's kind of why I never did that, was because to me, it was more helpful to just have the additional time from going straight through as opposed to using up an extra minute or two um, skipping around between questions.
I understand. That's valid.
Okay, so um, let's go back to the passage. Now, the whole point of me going over the different question types here is looking at number three. What type of question do you think that one is?
Let's say you said extrapolate. Is this also, is that the extrapolation that you were talking about for RBT?
Yeah, so it sounded to me like when you first saw question three, I think you were interpreting it as a foundations of comprehension question. Is that right?
It was a mix between within the text and comprehensions. So
Okay,
anything but the beyond the text.
right, exactly. And so this one is actually reasoning beyond the text, and it's kind of tough to tell just when you first see the question. I think it's reasonable to think that it might be comprehension. Um, but the important part here is that um, these answer choices, they're not exactly saying things that are in the passage necessarily. Like, at least a few of the answer choices are introducing something that's not really stated in the passage, and it's just asking which of these statements, and so you can assume the statements are um, new information. It's saying which of these new pieces of information is least relevant to the main point of the passage. And so some of them are going to sound like they're kind of in the passage just because all the wrong answer choices are relevant to the passage. And so they are going to be pretty similar. And so what you're looking for is which one of these uh, does not have anything to do with the main point.
Okay, I see. So it's literally direct on not necessarily supporting like question two, but more
Hmm.
of is this pertaining to the main idea or not?
Yeah,
Flat out.
exactly. So you want to think of the main idea is just kind of the state of European nations in this particular time period. And then you look at each of these and which of them is the least relevant to that.
Okay. So I have in my head of like general locations where I could attest backup,
Okay.
but then mm, I don't know. I really don't like these questions, but so be it.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, these questions are definitely hard. Another strategy that you can use for this question would be so if you're thinking the main idea of the passage, you could basically look for how frequently is something mentioned in the passage, and the more frequently it's mentioned, the more likely it is to be connected to the main idea.
yeah.
So looking at each of these answer choices, so for choice A, you would want to look for how often or like what percentage of the passage is talking about the European middle class, and is it So where it says political ideologies like nationalism, is that relevant or not?
See, I thought straight up that it wasn't.
Okay. Um, so if you think that it's not, then so I think that's good, and you could be leaning towards answer choice A, thinking that that's the right answer. And now I would just look at all of the other ones and just check and see.
Right. Um, oh, now I'm starting to overthink. Perfect. Okay. I know that I want to eliminate C though, because that does lead to one of the points implied later.
Yeah. Um, right. So I think C is relevant
Right.
because so even in paragraph one, it talks about the arts,
Mhm.
and then um paragraph two, it's talking about artists in Italy, and
Mhm.
then the whole last paragraph is talking about art. So yeah, I think art is very relevant.
Mhm. Hmm. And then again, same thing with D. That's been basically the theme of different political and societal changes within every or within different nations.
Hmm.
Um, and it even introduced that well enough in the first paragraph as well.
Right.
So I think so D would also be relevant as C. So again, leaning to A and B, but the thing that I don't like about B is the rapid, significant social change. That's what's
Okay.
throwing me off. And I don't know if it's because I'm looking into it too much or I'm trying to talk myself out of my original
Okay.
about A. I don't know. This is where I'm like, okay, how much am I actually pertaining to the paragraph or to the passage and how much am I just overthinking of what I'm reading?
Yeah, I mean, this one is kind of hard. So my suggestion is focus on the dates that they're giving you.
Right. That's why I'm like, well, A seems more realistic because we're talking about 1890 and late. Wait,
Okay,
I
but
take that back.
also, so
End of
B,
18th.
it's talking about the early 19th century, but check paragraph one, kind of the beginning of paragraph one.
Yeah, that's why I said I take that back because that's where this is the part where I didn't read the rest of it because it's saying which excited them from the end of the 18th century to the middle of the 19th.
Right.
Is that where you were referring to, or did
Yeah,
you think?
exactly.
Okay.
So if it said the late 19th century in Europe was characterized by rapid social change, that would be kind of going against what the passage is saying. But since it says the early 19th century, that is consistent with the point of the passage. And I would say the whole focus of the passage is like the effects of that social change.
So it doesn't, I see. So even so rapid and significant are kind of like fillers. More.
Well, it says political fever. And so I think that kind
Um,
of implies rapid and significant.
okay.
Um, let's see. I'm trying to see if there's any other evidence for that. Um, yeah, I mean, it's talking about England. It says they have a parliamentary system, they have the colonies, they have done so it's talking about a lot of different things that have happened. And so yeah,
Hmm.
I think rapid and significant does have support.
Okay.
And this is definitely a hard question though. I kind of wrote this one intentionally for it to be really difficult.
I figured.
It might be slightly harder than what you'll see on the real test, but I've actually seen in the AAMC material some questions that are this hard. So, um,
Yeah.
yeah, but I think your first instinct was good for this one, and A is the right answer.
Okay.
So yeah, make sure you don't talk yourself out of the right answer, which I think people do a lot. Does that ever happen to you? Like you choose an
Yes.
answer and then you go back and review and then change it?
All the time, especially during cars. And that's where it just goes downhill. It's either 50-50 and then it goes downhill.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say don't review your answers because I do think it's helpful to do that.
Mhm.
But if your instinct is telling you to go with one answer, unless you find good evidence for a different one, then just go with the one that you're leaning
Right. Yeah.
towards. Okay.
It's just
So,
hard for cars versus other sections because that's more knowledge, but this is straight up in front of you. So can you
yeah,
pinpoint where it is, or are you just calling your own bluff at this point?
yeah, it's definitely like I think reviewing is definitely more helpful in the other sections than it is for cars. But I do think ideally in the cars section you want to finish with like 5 minutes left. And then if you have a couple questions that you flagged, you can go back and look at those. But overall, it's better to um, not spend as much time reviewing, and I think it's better to spend more time just actually
Mm.
answering the questions.
Do you then recommend more of the tutored mode on UWorld? So it's actually like we're doing right now, kind of explaining everything and you're learning on the spot after you answer the question,
Um,
at least for the beginning. And then once timing starts to become the main focus, switch off to,
maybe, but it's kind of tough to say because if you're doing it that way, it will inflate your score a little bit because if they're telling you the
I,
explanation for the first question, that's going to help with all the other questions.
yeah,
So
exactly.
I would hesitate to do that. I think it's better to review them all after you do the passage.
Okay.
I think that for this, like in live tutoring, I think it makes sense
Okay.
because not I'm not only giving you feedback after you answer the question, but also kind of as you're answering it, like in terms of the process. And
Mhm.
so if they did that on UWorld, I think that would be helpful. But if they're just giving you feedback after you answer it, I would say wait until you do the whole passage.
Okay. Okay. Sorry, I have a follow-up question. Sorry, I
Okay,
don't mean to
go ahead.
cut through. Um, Following for what you said earlier, that when you have potentially 5 minutes left of the section, you want to go back through the flagged questions. So
Mhm.
you are in favor of leaving questions flagged even though you're going to the next passage?
Um, I think you should avoid doing that if possible. But if
Okay.
you have a question that's just really hard and you're really unsure, then yeah, you can do that.
Okay.
Um, like if you have a question that you've already used up like 2 minutes looking at the question and you're still not 100% sure about it, um, then yeah, you probably should move on at that point. Um, but overall, I would say avoid doing that because
Okay.
then if you go back to it, the passage is not going to be fresh in your mind and you're going to have to look back at it more, and that will make it harder. But
Agreed.
I also think if you see a question and move on, sometimes you'll just have a moment of insight where you realize what the answer is.
Mm,
Um, so try to have maybe no more than 3 or 4 questions flagged for the whole section.
okay.
Okay, does that answer your question?
Yes, we can go to
Okay.
four.
All right. Number 4, the passage implies that Germany blank. Okay, so we should know where to look for this one.
Mhm. So this is now within the text.
Um, this one I would say is more foundations of comprehension.
Dang it. Okay. All
Um,
right.
and the reason for that is because it's not really about making connections between things or looking for evidence for something. It's more like just interpreting what the passage says.
So Germany is towards the end. Okay. Mm. All right. So my thought process is that I'm assuming this was before going through, but that it has potentially something to do with the difference of the political and romance um aspect of the culture. So
Okay.
then again, then well, that's not true. Well, I'm more focused on the last section or last paragraph, which I don't think is even safe to even rule out because of the additional information in paragraph 3.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of have to look at both paragraph 3 and 4 for this one. So I think that answer choice A, that's more relevant to paragraph 3. Choice B
Right,
is more relevant to paragraph 4, and then so on. Like it depends on the answer choice.
right, right, right. I feel like automatically A, C, and D are all wrong because they're all saying how weak their political strength is, but it's the opposite.
Okay. Well, I think it makes sense for A and C. D is a little bit different.
Where, mhm. Is this where we would need to know more of the history?
Yeah, so I think A and C are wrong because they contradict the passage. They're saying Germany is politically weak, but the passage says that it's strong. D is wrong just because the passage doesn't even mention anything about that, so it's just irrelevant.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Um, and then so we kind of narrowed it down to B just by eliminating the other ones. But do you
Right.
see any evidence for B?
Oh, absolutely. Last paragraph. Oh, okay, I have it. As for Germany, the romance was dry, though
Yeah.
its roots remain buried in the mysterious subsoil.
Yeah, exactly right. So for this one, I would say it's probably one of the easier questions because you could eliminate A, C, and D, and we also have pretty good evidence for B. So pretty
Mhm.
straightforward for this one. Um, so on the real test, if you see a question like this is where you can try to save yourself some time and do it faster than you do for the other questions.
Mhm.
Um, because in terms of your CARS score, it sounds to me like part of the reason it's not as high as you would want it to be is just because you're not finishing all the questions. And so if you see a question like this, if you can save yourself time and answer it faster, that will help you in terms of finishing the whole section and having more time for the harder questions.
I understand. Yeah.
So that's something to focus on. Like for the foundations of comprehension questions, sometimes it's best to just pick something and move on if you're reasonably sure.
Hmm. I understand. I know that sometimes also a lot of doubt comes in because I know I'm weak in this section. So then there will be a lot of that. It can't be that straightforward. But then with the sciences, is like, I mean, it's right or wrong. Like you either know it or you don't, or you understand what you're looking at or you don't. But
Right. Yeah, I mean, cars is actually a really straightforward section. Like it's not to say that it's easy, but it is definitely straightforward. Like if you have evidence for a certain answer choice, that's going to be the right answer.
I overcomplicate everything. So of course I always have just like a step back moment in so many of these questions. But
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think it's good to try to get in the habit of like not trying to read between the lines, but instead just take everything literally that they say. And if it seems like it's too easy, it's you probably just found the right evidence.
exactly, yeah, valid.
Okay. So number 5, based on the passage, one could predict Then which of the following people would be most satisfied with the political situation in the late 19th century? All right, so what type of question do you think this one is?
One of those annoying RBTs.
Yep, that's right.
Okay. Sometimes I know kind of how to start with these questions because the way that I think about these is that they're in parallel with the main idea. Or is that the incorrect approach?
Um, I think that's kind of true, but I also think that you have to look at the specifics.
Okay.
So for choice A German army general, I just realized I forgot to capitalize German, but so you want to focus on where in the passage it talks about Germany, and then just see how relevant that is, and then also focus it says army general. So okay, so what about the German military? And then for
Mm,
B, an English factory worker, so you find where it's talking about England, and then you want to see if there's any evidence related to factory worker, and so on.
I see. Okay. Okay. So the political situation in Germany. Um, I want to eliminate C and D
Okay,
because in the second paragraph, again, it explains that she had not found in it the sort of well-being she most desired, the industrial and economic prosperity. So she's kind of France didn't really fulfill what they wanted. And then the
okay.
same thing underlines with Italy later in the paragraph. Not regain her place as a European power, nor in rising again from her glorious ashes.
Right. And then also, you kind of want to focus on specifically where it says Italian artist. And then, so in paragraph two, talking about Italy,
Oh,
it says, um, had not regained place as European power, nor could she reanimate the dust of the heroes, the great captains, and the sublime artists.
I
So that's
see.
also pretty relevant, but you were already on the right track in getting rid of that one.
You see. Okay. And that's where the factory worker comes in, the industrial prosperity.
Um, for England.
Yeah. Oh, JK.
Um,
France. I'm so sorry.
oh, okay, yeah. Yeah,
Never
so for
mind.
that one, you do need to look specifically at the England part.
Hmm. But I don't even think that England was even mentioning regarding the industrial.
Okay, good. Yeah, so it doesn't actually mention that for England.
Because it
Um,
does more of the parliamentary, so that aspect, but the factory worker was more specific on the France. So I guess that
right.
even,
Well, so here's how I would think about it at this point. So it does say that England is doing pretty well at this point.
Mhm.
So B could be the right answer, but because it says factory worker, I would think that B is probably not the right answer, but it definitely could be. So you don't cross it out quite yet. And then
Mhm.
check A.
Yeah.
If A is pretty convincing, definitely go with A. But
Hmm.
if A is like, if you're sure that A is wrong, then that's when you think, okay, well, maybe B is right, just because the passage says that England is doing well overall.
Right. I understand.
Okay.
Unfortunately, this is not the case, considering Germany had obtained the military supremacy
Right.
and the nation of the fatherland was dismembered by feudalism. So it would have to be A.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, pretty straightforward for this one. Pretty good support for A, and so yeah, this one is A.
Okay.
Okay, so that's it for this passage. So I think overall, um, it seemed like you definitely did better on the later questions in the passage. I guess just kind of getting used to it and seeing more of the passage probably helped. What are your thoughts overall?
I agree. I think first up, like at the beginning, it starts off rough, but then afterwards it's more of getting the hang of it.
Hmm.
Um, Again, it definitely helps to know what I'm reading at first, so that's just gonna come with practice. But overall with
Yeah.
questions, once the comprehensive aspect is there, then the questions are more free flowing.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and I think that it seems like you're normally finding the right evidence pretty quickly. And I think what you said is true about it's more interpreting the evidence that's hard, not so much finding it.
Correct, yeah. And that's yeah. And then the interpretation is really what's causing the time, I
Right,
think.
right. And then again, I think reading the passage faster will also help a lot with timing.
Mhm.
But that's something that takes a lot of practice, and it's something that you kind of have to get used to. So if you're taking the test in a little bit over a month, you would definitely want to try to start cutting down on the passage reading time pretty soon if you can.
Yeah, okay, okay.
Okay.
Mhm.
So we can do another passage or end here. It's up to you.
Um, we could do another.
Okay, sure. Do you want to do another one of my passages or an AAMC passage?
Let's do AMC.
Okay, sounds good. Then we can go to Cars Question Pack 2. Um, and then let me know if you've already done passage 4 or not.
Give me 1 minute. I probably
Okay.
have to look through. Did I touch anything from volume two? Maybe I didn't. I think I finished the diagnostic and volume one, but I don't think I finished volume two.
Okay, sounds good.
So I think we're good.
Okay. Then yeah, let's just do passage 4.
Sounds good.
This is another history one.
Do you want me to pull it up on mine? Because I know that the screen's not sharing.
Yeah, I think it's easiest if we both just have it pulled up, um,
Okay.
so that you can kind of scroll through it and find the evidence because it doesn't show the whole thing at once for my screen.
Right. Okay. No worries. Did you have students take the exam this past weekend?
Yeah, I had some people take it on the 12th. Yeah, I don't know if I had anybody take it. Or yeah, I guess that is this past Friday. So yeah, yeah.
How do they feel about it?
I think pretty good for the most part. One of them who took it then was doing really well on her full lengths before that. So yeah, I'm thinking pretty good.
Good.
You said that's when you took it, right?
Yep. Okay. I was starting with 21, right?
Yeah, 21.
Okay.
All right, do you see it now?
Yep.
Okay, so I'm gonna get the timer again. So let's do this the same way. Or actually, um, okay, so here's one alternative that I think helps some people. So instead of writing out summaries for each section, what you could do is highlight the section breaks. So again, I like doing it in 3 sections. So I would just read until I think that it's going from the introduction to more of kind of the middle, and then just highlight the first sentence of that. And then if you see a big section break after that, you could highlight the first sentence of that. Um, that is a little bit faster way of doing it. Like you don't actually have to write anything out. The downside is that it doesn't really help you as much in terms of um, getting a good summary of each section, because I think actually writing it out helps a lot as far as articulating your summary.
Mhm.
So it's kind of up to you. Like, which of those methods do you think would help more?
Honestly, I might have to do both and see what happens, but as of
Okay.
now, I'll keep writing it out.
Okay. Sounds good. Just let me know whenever you're ready to start reading. And
Mhm.
for this one, let's try it a little bit faster if you can. So maybe 3 to 3.5 minutes.
Okay, sounds good.
All
You can
right.
start.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. So
Thank-
that was good. That was 3 minutes and 10 seconds. Um,
Okay.
did it feel rushed, or do you think you understood it well?
A little rushed, but I got a flow.
Okay. Good.
So yes and
Um, so as far as just kind of the overall point, what did you think?
no. I think it was more of the role of the I don't know how to say it, agrarian myth
Uh-huh.
throughout
Yeah.
American history. Broken up into three sections.
Okay.
This one
Um,
was easier to break it up to.
yeah, I do think this one it's pretty straightforward in terms of the sections here. So yeah, for the main idea, I agree. I think it's just talking about um the agrarian myth and its um kind of its prevalence at different time periods. And just its importance in general. So how did you break it down into sections?
Section one went into, excuse me, from the first paragraph down to the fourth paragraph. So the first three paragraph was section one, explaining the agrarian myth and its background.
Okay. Um Yes, I think the way that I would have done it is probably the first two paragraphs and then a section break after that. But
Okay.
I don't think it's necessarily right or wrong either way. And yeah, I can see how you could break it down like that. I think the beginning is just kind of introducing the agrarian myth and talking about what are the characteristics of it. So introducing it, and then what does the agrarian yeoman farmer look like?
Mhm.
Okay. And then what did you say for the middle?
So the middle was fourth and fifth paragraph. Um, I think you're probably going to say the fifth paragraph is going to be a little towards the third section, based on.
No, actually, I think the way I would have done the middle would be paragraphs 3, 4, and 5.
Oh, okay.
So yeah,
Um,
I think grouping 4 and 5 definitely makes sense.
I just did that more of, okay, this is the role of it in just American history in revolution, like in that aspect, but then it transitions into, again, more of how it plays into agriculture, which is still part of American history. But I broke that and the remainder of it as just American agriculture rather than tying it into history.
Okay. Um, so if I were actually writing down these summaries on a page, I think for the first section, paragraphs 1 and 2, I would have said um, characteristics of agrarian myth. And then for the middle section, which I would say is paragraphs 3, 4, and 5, I would say um, Historical perceptions of agrarian myth, probably. Um, because I think those three paragraphs are talking about how true was it in the past and how did people perceive it in the past.
Okay. And
All right.
then
And then for the end, what did you say for that?
that was where I said it was strictly about the American agriculture, and I drew an arrow from section 3 to section 1 because it was drawing back to how some of the stuff that they were doing, like for standard agriculture, it doesn't necessarily have to be playing a role in order to be considered as part of the myth. But that's just my arrow. That was just me saying it's going back to the main idea. But this is like the agriculture of the myth is its own section. I don't know if
Okay.
that makes sense.
Um, all right, so for the last section, what I would say for that one, the main point would be change.
Oh,
Um, I think the last section is talking about how, um, so most of the passage it's talking about a long time ago, this agrarian myth. The last section, the last two paragraphs, are talking about how at this point in history, between 1815 and 1860, the agrarian myth was starting to be replaced by industrial commercial agriculture.
oh, okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, so it was changing from the myth aspect to the standardized industrial commercial.
Yeah.
Okay.
Um, and I think a good sentence to highlight if you were doing highlighting for this one would be the second to last paragraph, first sentence. Between 1815 and 1860, the character of American agriculture was transformed. I
Mm,
would say that's kind of a section break, and it's introducing the idea that the whole end section will focus on.
I see. Okay.
So maybe it would be beneficial to do the highlighting. You could try doing highlighting and writing stuff down, and then as you get closer to the actual test, figure out what is helping more, and then try to get rid of the other. So if you find that highlighting is more helpful, then you don't need to write things down anymore. You can just remember it mentally. But if you think writing it down is more helpful, then maybe you could yeah, I guess you could do both, highlight and writing down. It just depends. But I think in terms of timing, that would be kind of harmful to do both.
Sure. I know what you mean. Okay.
All right. So
But
let's get to the or did you have another question?
it was just more for section 2 for the historical perceptions, does that they still do go into the agricultural aspect of how the myth is tied in, right? I mean, yeah, they do. Or
Yeah,
is
I mean, I think that's kind of the whole passage though.
okay.
Because
And
that I mean that's essentially what the myth is. Like it's an idea about agriculture. So I think the entire passage is focusing on American agriculture.
okay.
Okay. Everything in the passage makes sense. Ready to start on the questions?
Yes.
Okay, great. So number one, the central argument of the passage is that the agrarian myth blank. Okay, so this is pretty convenient. We have a main idea question first. So one thing that I think is important for these main idea questions, so it's good to have an understanding of the main idea um, just as you read the passage, but also if you have a question asking about it, I think going back to paragraph one or just kind of the introduction section is usually helpful. And I've found that it's very rare that there will be a correct answer choice to a main idea question that's not mentioned in paragraph one. or like that's not the focus of paragraph one.
Mm-hmm.
So
I
that's
understand.
generally where you want to look for evidence. So just go ahead and I would say look at the answer choices first for this one, and then take a look at paragraph one and tell me what you think.
Um, Definitely, I mean, two of the four answer choices are already saying that, I mean, they're negative straight up, but there's no actual tone with paragraph one. It's more very neutral.
Okay.
So that's why I thought of A and D would be incorrect.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah, I think so.
and then for B and C, it was saying that the second sentence that Aryan myth represents a kind of homage that Americans have paid to the fancied innocence of their origins. So it's going back like from day one till now, but it's not necessarily stating like looking at it as a whole. It doesn't seem C really falls into like both past and today, but it's really more of that transition and transformation that B is supporting.
Okay. Yeah. So I think B definitely has more support there. Um, it also has the word sentimental in the very first sentence of the passage, which is also in B. So that's a pretty good clue that it might be B. Um, and then C, I think, is just too specific. Like,
Mhm.
that's just not really the focus of the passage. It does mention whether or not it's accurate in paragraph um, 5 that says to what extent was the agrarian myth actually false, but that's more of a minor point in the passage. So
Right.
regardless of whether C is true or not based on the passage, it's not really the central argument.
Hmm.
So yeah, so good job on this one. This one is B.
Okay.
Um, Everything makes sense for this one.
Yes.
Okay. Second question. The passage suggests that the agrarian myth originated blank. Okay, so this is a very specific question. Where would you look for evidence?
This is more of the background. So first section.
Okay.
No. The or well, okay, section two is saying that it was more of the history.
So I would say you kind of narrow it down. It's either going to be section one or two. It's not going to be the end. So at
I
this
mean,
point, I would skim through the first two sections and see if you see something talking about the origin.
the third paragraph or sentence.
Yeah, exactly. So paragraph three just starts out in origin. So that's definitely going to be the place to look for evidence. So just reread that paragraph and then, well, actually, yeah, it's up to you if you want to look at the answer choices or the paragraph first. I think either way is fine for this one.
It's circling around a literary idea. So it's all about the education literature, about agriculture, basically.
Hmm.
So leaning towards A
Okay.
as the most support.
Are you confident enough in A to just choose that one, or do you think you need to look at the other ones too?
I don't know if I just need to read further. That's why I'm more of, or is this enough information? That's why. Uh,
Um, so I think that paragraph three is definitely where all the evidence is going to be. Because if you read a little bit further, it changes topic, and then it's
right.
talking about mass creed. So that's a little bit different. So paragraph three has all of the evidence. Um, so I think that the first sentence there is very strong support for A.
Mhm.
And so I would probably just pick A and move on if I were doing this question. But in general, you want to kind of avoid doing that unless you're just really sure about it. So
Right.
it kind of depends. I mean, you can look at B, C, and D and check those if you want to. Um, but if I were doing this on the real MCAT, I might just pick A and go to the next one.
I'm just skeptical because of just how short, but then also B, C, and D are not underlining anything around it.
Yeah. Well, so B, it is talking about it's a preoccupation of the upper classes who owned country estates, but where it
Mhm.
says Europe, that's what makes B wrong. Is just because the passage is not talking about Europe. Um, if it didn't mention Europe though, then B would also be right. Um,
Mhm.
and then C on small farms owned and worked by yeoman farmers. Well, that was just wrong because it's talking about upper classes who had large farms. Um, and then D is also one of those where it's only wrong because of one particular word. Which word do you think that would be for D?
It's romanticized.
No, it's actually urban because
Oh,
paragraph three is talking about it is talking about the upper classes, so you could think of that as the elite, but it's talking about the rural elite, not the urban elite, and that's why D is wrong.
okay. Tedious. Wow.
Yeah, so this one is a very detailed kind of question. Um, and A, B, and D would all be right if not for those just
One.
individual words in B and D.
Wow.
But I do think, though, just because it starts out in origin, the agrarian myth was not a popular but a literary idea. I mean, that's just very, very good support for A. So if you see something that's that obvious, then you don't necessarily have to consider the other ones. But then again, for this one, if you do look at the other answer choices, they might kind of look tempting because they are close. So, um, yeah, you just want to make sure you don't overthink it. Just try to focus on the details and what does the passage actually say.
Okay.
Um, okay, so the next question, based on the passage, the agrarian myth assumes that blank. All right, so this is one of those choose all that apply questions. So the way that I like to do these is on my scratch paper, I would write out a one, a two, and a three, and then actually write down what I think for each of them. And I think that helps you keep it in mind where you don't forget, which could potentially happen. So I would either, if I'm really sure that one of them is right or wrong, I would put maybe like yes or no. But most of the time, I would write down a percentage, like what percent chance I think that a particular one is correct. So let's just start with number one. Yeoman farmers are wholesome and honest. Where would you look for evidence for that?
In the background section of the myth.
Right. So like kind of the first section.
Yeah. So more or less paragraph two.
Okay, great.
Um, the second half of it goes into the yeoman. Simple, honest, independent, healthy, happy human being because he lives close to me. I mean, yeah, it says wholesome and honest.
Yeah, I mean it does have both of those words, honest and then wholesomeness. So I would think that's pretty good support for number one. What do you think in terms of like the percentage chance that number one is right based on
100.
that? Yeah, I think that's about right. Something very high, I would write down for
Yeah.
number one. Okay. What
Mhm.
about two? This one's going to be a little bit more complicated.
Morally superior. So it's something regarding, I mean, it says that their integrity impossible for depraved populations of cities, close communication is likely believed to have also integrity impossible for the depraved. I'm 50-50.
Okay.
Um, there's a part, where is it? In the same paragraph, unstinted praise of the special virtues of the farmer and the special values of rural life, yada yada. Important to society had a special right to the concern and protection of government. I don't know if that
Hmm.
could be more shown as a show of morale, but not
Maybe.
necessarily versus the ideal man and ideal citizen who is best. It's just showing that they both have morale.
Okay. So yeah, it says its hero was the yeoman farmer, who's the ideal man and the ideal citizen. And then last sentence of that paragraph says his life was believed to have wholesomeness and integrity impossible for the depraved population of cities. So I would
Mhm.
say both of those do support number two to some extent. The question is, are they strong enough for number two? Because number two, it says yeoman farmers are morally superior to most citizens, which is worded pretty strongly. And so, for that to be right, the passage not only has to say that the yeoman farmers are good, but also that they're morally superior to most citizens. So,
Right.
what do you think for number two? Is that enough evidence or is it not?
I don't think so, but I may be missing something. I think not.
Okay, right. So, I think with just those quotes from paragraph two, it's kind of it's not really conclusive either way. Like it could be yes, could be no. So my suggestion is keep reading and see if you can find anything that's more directly relevant.
To two.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so this is the origin. Oh, there. Okay, there you go. Uh, yeah, reading further helps.
Okay.
Roots of this change may be found as far back as American Revolution, which appeared to many Americans as the victory of a band or embattled farmers over an empire, seem to confirm the moral and civic superiority of the yeoman.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
So
so yeah, that makes it 60 to 100%.
yeah. So number two is definitely right based on that. And I think that's overall just kind of a good strategy in the cars section is um, if you're looking for evidence, you see things that are sort of relevant, but it's inconclusive one way or the other, you may need to just keep reading, and then eventually you'll find something that tells you. Um, that's not always true. Sometimes it will be, um, it's not going to be spelled out for you quite to that extent, but I would say probably most of the time it will.
Sure.
So yeah, number two is definitely right. Now, what about number three?
Deserve special treatment. Personally, I feel like that is a very strong
Yeah, it is.
and out of line. But
So, do you see any evidence in the passage talking about government?
that's what I'm trying to find.
Okay.
And I don't know if it was more of a historical aspect or not.
I will say that the quote that's relevant for this one is actually one that you mentioned talking about number two. So you have already found it.
Oh, oh, I see. As a calling uniquely productive, uniquely important to society, had a special right to concern and protection of government. Okay, I guess. Yeah. So it seems like it needs because it's a calling uniquely productive, uniquely important to society, special right to concern and protection of government.
Yeah.
But is that pertaining to agriculture or is it?
Um, yeah, so it says
It is.
agriculture as a calling uniquely productive and uniquely important.
Okay, so I guess it is all three.
Yeah, exactly. So this one is going to be D, all three of them. So what you notice is some of them, when you first read it, you might think that it's too extreme and that it's not supported by the passage, but it's still important to go back and see if you can find evidence for it, because sometimes those will actually be correct.
Yeah.
It just depends on what the details in the passage actually say.
Mhm.
So, again, I think it's a good idea to focus on the details. Don't think of it just in terms of the big picture, and make sure that you have specific evidence for each one.
Got it. Okay.
All right. Any questions on that one?
No, we're good.
Okay, great. Next one, based on the passage, the agrarian myth became part of the mass creed because blank. Okay, so where will the evidence be for this one?
One, two, three, paragraph 4. So that is the history of the myth.
Yep, that's right.
Is this within text?
Um, this one is yes, it's reasoning within the text.
I want to wait. Symbol of the nation. Oh, okay. Well, I guess that answered my question. Um, I thought A was neat, because it basically restated what Mass Creed was.
Okay.
Except I wasn't sure about the second half of it, need of the kind of patriotic sentiments that the agrarian myth could provide, except it
Right.
does explain later in the paragraph that um, the root of this change seemed to confirm the moral civic superiority of the yeoman, made the farmer symbol of the new nation, wove the agrarian myth into its patriotic sentiments and Republican idealism.
Mm-hmm.
So A seemed very plausible. Um, B, however, did not explain what American victory. That's out of scope. Um, there was no, I don't recall anything about six. So, well, that's not true. Victory of a band of embattled farmers over an empire. But I don't think that's actually explaining the why.
Okay. So you're thinking A at this point?
Yeah.
And then what about C and D?
parts that I don't like about D, I'm going to D because I forgot my reasoning for C. It was more of many of the realities of American life, but we don't know what are these realities.
Okay.
JK,
Yeah.
I see now.
Well,
But that's saying why it's actually false. That's the support
yeah.
for false, not for the mass creed.
Yeah, exactly. It's so C and D are both talking about something different, basically. So we're looking at paragraph 4, which is the mass creed paragraph, and then paragraph 5, where it's talking about is the agrarian myth false or not? Does it correspond to the realities? That's kind of a separate point. It doesn't have anything to do with the mass creed. So you can cross out C and D just based on that.
Mhm.
So between A and B, um, okay, so you're leaning towards A. Um, all right, so here's what I will say for this one. A is one of those answer choices. It definitely sounds plausible. I want you to reread that paragraph with choice A in mind and see if it is supported in the details. So, is the passage saying that the nationalist ideology stood in need of patriotic sentiments?
Well, that's the part I'm kind of skeptical about
Right.
because it's not hand in hand with each other. It's more of one led to another.
Okay.
I don't know if that even makes sense.
Well, my advice for this one is just try to stay focused on what's in the passage. So I think this is where you are making a little bit of an assumption. Um, and it seems like in general, you've done a pretty good job not doing that. But I think for this one, that would be an assumption. What about B? So try to reconsider B, thinking about what does the passage actually say?
I see. Okay. So the paragraph is stating the myth became a mass creed, and then it explains. And then it was saying, well, this is all because of the victory that the farmers had, and this role plays into the characteristics of a mass creed, which is why they consider it.
Yeah, I mean, it's just saying by the early 19th century, it became a mass creed, and then it says the roots of this change. Okay,
Mhm.
so that's telling you why it became a mass creed. May be found as far back as the American Revolution and the victory of farmers over an empire. So this one, it's all about just interpreting what the passage says straightforwardly. Because for A, that one you had to um, kind of think about it a lot, and it requires a lot of extrapolating from what's in the passage, but then B is just stated in the passage.
I understand.
Okay, so just overall, the big takeaway from this one is if one of the answer choices is stated in the passage and the other one is not, the one that's actually in the passage will be right, and whichever one has a kind of simpler logic for why it's right will be the right one.
hmm Okay.
All right, everything makes sense for this one?
Yeah.
Okay. Then let's go to the next one. According to the passage, the agrarian myth implied that yeoman farmers were what? So this one, um, you might have to look in multiple spots for evidence, but
Mhm.
overall, I think the beginning and paragraph 2 is a good place to start, at least.
So was reading through paragraph 2 and then second sentence saying its hero was the yeoman farmer, central conception, the notion that he is the ideal man and the ideal citizen.
Okay.
But that's not enough.
Right. I mean, if you look at the answer choices, that doesn't exactly correspond with any of them, so that means you do need to keep reading.
Right. No. Uh, uh, mm, I feel like there are phrases that just work. I don't know. Um, I don't think it's B.
Okay. Yeah. I would agree that B is one that you probably can cross out.
Mhm. Um, I like A because it's saying from, I'm not saying it's correct, but just I'm in favor. So of the second paragraph when stating the young man who owned a small farm and worked with the aid of his family, encouraged a simple, honest, independent, healthy, happy human being.
Okay.
So it's thinking that, yep, they owned a small farm, entrepreneur, they're honest, word for word there, but still not sure of it actually if it applies to the myth itself or not.
Okay.
Um, and then it calls in to the transformation of the agriculture. What's it's making me kind of suspicious about it because it's talking about the commercial, the like the change into the commercial agriculture and
Right.
not necessarily of the agrarian myth,
Okay. Right.
like the change of that. So,
And you're
but
thinking
it
about that in relation to A?
a little bit because
Okay.
then as it goes reading, the cash crop converted the young man into a small entrepreneur in the development of blah, blah, blah. So
Yeah.
it's
Okay.
saying, but then that goes against from what I thought earlier of they're an honest entrepreneurs, but this is more saying no, now they are, before they weren't.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's good that you found that. Because I do think that's a pretty common mistake on this question is to assume that because they own a small farm, they're an entrepreneur. But what the passage is actually saying is that they used to not be, and then now they're converted into an entrepreneur. So this is one of those situations where you have to think about how the passage is using a certain word, and it may
Mhm,
not line up exactly with what you are thinking,
mhm,
but these questions are all going to be based on what's actually in the passage. And so the passage is saying they used to not be an entrepreneur and now they are. So that would make you think that A is probably not right.
mhm.
Okay. So what about C and D?
This is more of where I was saying that they don't really want to do the agriculture for profit or for business, which is the industrious part of D.
Okay. Well, So this is another vocab thing I would say. The word
Yeah.
industrious, like even though it does sound like industry in terms of like industrialism, that sort of thing, the word industrious itself actually just means hardworking.
They were hard work. They still wanted to be independent. Um, they were a hardworking lot in old tradition, but no longer did they grow or manufacture what they need. They concentrated on the cash crop and began to buy more and more of the supplies. But that's again talking about the after.
Yeah, it is talking about after, but one thing you'll notice there, it says in the old tradition. So that kind of references back to before, like the yeoman farmers.
Oh,
Um, but then also, even looking earlier in the passage, so paragraph 2, where you said he owned a small farm and worked it with the aid of his family, that definitely could support hardworking to some extent.
yeah. That's why I was wondering between A and D, and then when I found A as being um false, then I thought, okay, maybe D,
Yeah,
and also investing by having a small farm working and then again showing that hard work later within the change. It's just
yeah,
sentimentally patriotic goes against from what we analyze on the last question. So that's why I also was like, I don't know if that's even
yeah.
the
Well, so sentimentally patriotic, it that one, um, what the passage is saying is that the Americans who believe in this agrarian myth are sentimentally patriotic, not that the farmers themselves are. So that's why sentimentally patriotic is not the right answer because it doesn't really apply to the farmers. It's more the people who think that the agrarian myth is true.
I see. Okay.
So yeah, this one actually is D. Um, so in paragraph 2, it has the word happy, so that's good support for that. And then industrious, like we talked about, um, it says that um, he was uniquely productive, owned a small farm, worked it with the aid of his family. And then second to last paragraph where it says a hardworking lot in the old tradition. So all of those support industrious. So this one is D. This is a pretty hard question, though, I would say.
Okay. Or a hard lap. I completely missed the hardworking and the old tradition, even though I read over it, but the old tradition
Mhm.
supports from before.
Yeah, exactly. And it's hard because that's just a really minor point in that paragraph, and it's easy to overlook, but that is
Yeah.
the important evidence.
Okay.
All right, so we have one more question for this passage. Which of the following assertions, if true, would most weaken the main point of the passage? So we already had a main idea kind of question, so that should help a little bit with this one.
Mm-hmm. What did we say that was a sentimental representation of the role of agriculture? Hmm. Oh, I'm overthinking. No, no, I'm not. It's fine. Main point was that it helped to shape agriculture and like the whole change from agrarian myth of agriculture to the commercial ish.
Um, I mean, sort of. So, like, if so, go back to the first question for this passage, and this might be a good thing to do if you see two main idea questions like that. Just look at the previous one.
Yeah.
Um, Unfortunately, though, on the real test, you won't know whether you got the last one right, and so that makes it way harder. But
Mhm.
in this situation, you do know. And so the last one was B, sentimental representation of the role that agriculture played in American life. So you can kind of keep that in mind as you answer the last one.
Mhm. Sentimental. Okay. And also using the first sentence of paragraph 1 of all sentimental attachment to rural living with a series of notions about rural people and rural life. I want, I automatically go to C because it's only saying only a part of these people.
Okay. Yeah. Um, so it's saying Americans were raised with this attachment, and then yeah, so it's like the word Americans kind of implies that it's most Americans because it doesn't just say a few Americans, it says Americans. So yeah, I think that's pretty good support. Um, are there any other answer choices that you think might be true, or pretty much just C at this point?
I think A is going part of a support that contributes to the main idea and not the main idea itself.
Yeah, right. I think so. A weakens a minor point in the passage, but not really the main point. So you can
Um,
cross out A.
B is already stating and questioning, well, what if it is false? So it's already addressing that um,
Yeah,
and
and
reviewing
it's
it.
also that's not exactly the main point either, like whether or not it was actually true. I would say that is also a smaller point within the passage.
Mhm. And then originally I thought D, but that doesn't really play into the role of agriculture. No, I lied. It does. But
Well,
I don't
also think about D, like is that actually consistent with what the passage says? So
know.
check the dates there.
Yeah, 18th and 19th century. And this one is saying between 1815, 1860.
So that's the 19th century. It's saying the farmers during that century had little in common with the idealized yeoman farmer. But what about the 18th century?
Its stereotypes did indeed correspond to many of the realities of American agricultural life.
Right. So for this one, you don't even really have to consider whether D is relevant to the main point. D is wrong just because it contradicts the passage.
Mhm. So even if it does contradict the passage, couldn't it still weaken it though? Because
Or
it's
actually, okay, so here's what I should have said. It contradicts part of the passage and it supports part of the passage. Um, it contradicts the passage about the 18th century, and then it supports the part about the 19th century.
okay.
So that's why it's wrong, is because we're looking for something to weaken the passage, but choice D weakens and strengthens it.
I understand now. Okay, okay.
Okay.
All right.
So yeah, this one is C, and it's mainly just based on that very first sentence. And so, again, one thing you'll notice, all of these main idea type questions, they tend to be focused on the first paragraph, sometimes even mainly on the first sentence. So it's good to always, if your evidence doesn't correspond with the first paragraph, that's a clue that that might not be the right answer.
Okay, makes sense.
Okay. Yeah, so that's it for this passage. Any questions on that or any any overall takeaways from that passage?
No, not at all. This is very helpful.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, um, I think that this one, I would say, was kind of similar to the last one. I think maybe for this one, you made a little bit more assumptions. I think that was more of a problem for this one. For the last one, I don't think you really did that at all, which is good. But for this one, I would say for a few of the questions, that was a little bit of a problem. Um, but in general, I think you're finding the right evidence still. And so that's good. That's something that you want to keep doing. And then now the focus should be on interpreting the evidence and staying focused on what's actually in the passage when you choose an answer.
Hmm. And that's again more through practice and reading more.
Yeah, I think so. Um, so I would recommend use either UWorld or Jack Weston, whichever one of them you think is better. Um, and then obviously the AAMC materials too, but try to pace yourself with AAMC where you're doing some every week leading up to the test. Um,
Mm.
and then yeah, I think just doing more practice is going to help a lot when it comes to that. But make sure it's high quality practice. You don't want to get to where you're not really focused and then trying to practice for cars because that will probably make you get worse at cars rather than better if you're not fully focused when you're practicing. So make sure that you actually use the strategies that you're going to use on the real test.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay. Um, are you still meeting with your other tutor at all?
Honestly, she hasn't responded to me in the past week, so I
Oh,
have no
really?
idea. I'm assuming
Okay.
not.
Okay. Well, if you want to do any additional tutoring for cars or tutoring for any of the other sections, just let me know and we can meet again at some point, if you
Yeah.
think that would be helpful.
Oh, I definitely do. This was extremely beneficial, and I am
Okay, great.
very appreciative for what you have already done.
Okay, yeah, no problem. So, yeah, just send me a text then whenever you want to meet again, and we can definitely set that up.
Okay, cool. Are you Eastern or where are you located?
I am Eastern time. What about
Okay,
you?
same.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's good because a lot of people I tutor are Pacific, and that makes it way harder to
Oh
find a time.
God, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, because like I'm usually available mornings or kind of like early afternoons, but then they want to meet late at night, and I'm like, I would rather not do that.
Oh, yeah, that's a 3 hour difference. I don't blame
Yeah.
you.
Okay. Well, all right. Anything else you wanted to talk about today?
No, we are all set for now, and I will let you know and talk to Joe too to sort just with timing and scheduling with everything. And I will
Okay,
definitely text you soon.
great. Sounds good. Well, have a good rest of your day, and I will see you later.
You too. Thank you so much.
No problem. Bye.
Bye.